Okay, here we go. Welcome to this channel and this video. Here I will be doing a review of the new Mission Impossible movie, Final Reckoning, the 8th and final installment in this franchise, and a direct follow-up to 2023's Dead Reckoning. They're essentially a part 1 and part 2 of each other, even if they're not being labeled as that. And to just briefly give my opinion of Dead Reckoning, as it is very significant to Final Reckoning, I think it is one of the weaker films in the franchise. There's a lot of great action set pieces, and stylistically, visually, it's really great, but the narrative really lets it down. This idea of an AI antagonist is somewhat interesting in theory, as like this invisible, formless thing that Ethan has to outsmart rather than like physically overpower. But ultimately, the execution is quite weak. There's a lot of heavy exposition in this movie, and the general pace is pretty uneven. Really, unless there's action going on, it's a pretty uninteresting film. And a lot of the same criticisms lead directly into Final Reckoning. Once again, we have a very extended runtime. This movie is nearly 3 hours long, and it picks up about 2 or 3 months after the events of Dead Reckoning. Ethan has to take the key that he got from the end of that movie and put it into a submarine submerged somewhere in the Arctic to get into Final Reckoning. It is narratively just as convoluted and contrived as Dead Reckoning. It feels very bloated, like there's a lot of fat that they didn't really trim off in the editing room. Lots of over-explaining things to the audience, and really twiddling its thumbs and taking a very long time to get to the genuinely great action set pieces in here. There's 2 really great sequences near the second half of this movie, but the entire first half, which is an hour and a half long, is pretty devoid of any excitement or action in general, on top of having to recap Dead Reckoning in a very ham-fisted way and set up the world-threatening stakes of this one. This movie is also trying to do a lot of fan service, as it is presumably the final film in the franchise, and it's almost doing like this Avengers Endgame style of thing where this whole franchise has been building up, culminating into Final Reckoning, which just isn't really the case. That was the case with Marvel. Everything was building up to Endgame. But here, there wasn't any like through line between the Mission Impossible films. They're all very standalone. That's one of the great things about this franchise, is that you can kind of go into one of them pretty blind without having seen any of the other ones, and for the most part understand what was going on. But here they're trying to make Mission Impossible something it's not, which is like this very long epic series that has all been building up towards this one moment where Ethan fights an AI antagonist. This leads to a lot of retconning, a lot of callbacks, a lot of shoehorned in references to previous films. This one is specifically quite infatuated with the original Mission Impossible and has a couple of really odd references to it that I just find incredibly distracting and only build up that runtime even more. I think if you take away a lot of these callbacks, you could strip away like 30 minutes of this movie and it would be all the better for it. The first hour is incredibly weak, as it is almost like 25% reused material and only 75% actual new footage. There's so many clips from previous Mission Impossible films, and there's so many clips specifically from Dead Reckoning recapping what happened and just trying to like build up the momentum of like, this is the final one and everything has been building up to this. And it's just very manufactured and fake, and I think just makes this one a little bit ridiculous. And on top of all those flashbacks, the actual narrative of Final Reckoning is very clumsy and includes having to move characters in the position they're supposed to be. So the first 60 minutes are just shuffling characters around to different parts of the globe, and it's just like very awkward and moving at simultaneously too fast of a pace and too slow of a pace, taking too long to get to the action, but also like going so quickly that it's kind of disorienting and it's not giving room for character moments. I don't want to spoil anything, but there is a character death about 30 or so minutes into this movie that is somewhat emotionally affecting if they had actually given themselves time and space to like feel that emotion, but they just kind of whisk the viewer off to the next moment. And in the process of trying to make this feel like the most impossible mission yet, they end up adding a lot of contrivances that don't really need to be there. They just feel kind of extraneous. There's just so many obstacles, but in this case, I think less would have been more. If they had taken away a couple of these antagonists, then it would have been a more entertaining film. but they're trying to make this feel like insurmountable odds, and like there's so many things, so many hoops that they have to jump through, and it ends up just feeling really, really bloated and like overly complex. I usually don't like to say what a movie could have been. I like to just review it for what it is. But this movie could have worked incredibly well if it had been solely, or at least mostly, focused on Ethan Hunt. Instead, it has the team around him kind of being separated from him for the majority of the film, but what they're doing is just not nearly as interesting as what he's doing, and could have easily been removed from the film and it would have been a lot better. I think that the performances from these people are pretty solid. Haley Atwell and Simon Pegg are charming, and Pom Klementif, I think her name is, has a couple of solid one-liners, but ultimately their characters just aren't given anything interesting to do. And there's a couple of other people that are just sort of along for the ride and have like no character whatsoever. And there's literally a point where one of them's like, I don't have anything to do. So I don't know why they're adding in so many characters, and it just feels very unnecessary. And again, less would have been more. Just focusing on Ethan and, Benji and Luther could have worked incredibly well, but instead it's just very bloated and has a lot of unnecessary fat, which is a shame because at its core there is a pretty solid Mission Impossible movie in here if it was stripped down from 180 minutes to like 120 or even like 2 hours and 15 minutes. There is so many great set pieces here. There's two very extended ones that I absolutely love. The second act has this great submarine sequence that's just incredibly tense, very, very silent, besides like some great sound design and some like small menacing strings hanging in the background. It's entirely silent. There's no dialogue to it, and it is one of the best sequences in the entire film. Some really great underwater cinematography here, and I just wish the movie did more of this, did more of the spectacle and the action and what we want from a Mission Impossible movie, and less of all of the talking. The third act has a sequence I don't want to spoil, but it is heavily seen in the trailers and on the poster. It involves the two biplanes, and it is incredible. I think one of my favorite third acts in this entire series. Some incredible stunts in here. I can't believe they were able to pull this off. I can't believe that Tom Cruise survived this. It's undeniably impressive, and McQuarrie, the director of this film, does a great job of filming this and really like highlighting the practicality of it. There's so many shots where you can tell like this really happened, like Cruise really did all of this, and it's just awe-inspiring, incredible filmmaking on display. I would say about 90 minutes in is when the movie really hits its stride, once you get to that submarine sequence, but the entire first half is basically a lost cause, and even the second half, the issues of the first half permeate it, specifically with the plot. It's just very messy, but honestly, because the action set pieces are so good, I think there's a silver lining to this film. It definitely isn't the best version of itself, but it's certainly not a waste of time either. It's somewhat frustrating seeing this movie because there is something great within it that is just kind of hidden behind a lot of fluff. But ultimately, I do think it's a okay send-off to this franchise. Maybe crumbles underneath the weight of its own ambition with all of the fan service, but ultimately is a relatively good time at the movies and just has some really great moments, some very high highs, even if the lows are quite low. I am going to be giving this a 2.5 out of 5, and definitely think it's worth watching on the big screen because a lot of these set pieces I'm talking about are great with the spectacle of it, and the visuals are really, really good in this movie. So probably watch it on the big screen. I could see, fans of this, like diehard fans of Mission Impossible, being somewhat frustrated with this, and I think that's totally understandable. But there is some really great aspects to this movie. So yeah, 2.5 out of 5, and that's all I really have to say about this movie. In a few days, I will be doing a Mission Impossible Ranked where I might talk about this movie along with the rest of the franchise a little bit more. So check that out, I guess, and go watch Final Reckoning and see what you think. And yeah, that is all I got. So goodbye.